So today we're starting with a study about the monarchy in Israel. And it's interesting where Chronicles sort of picks up with the historical narrative of Israel, because the first 9 chapters is spent primarily in talking about the genealogy of the tribes. And as we looked at last week, just that prayer of Jabez, just to focus in on this, what I had referred to as an odd little story. And there's a few odd little stories in those first 9 chapters that we have looked at briefly. But then when it comes onto chapter 10, then the whole thing shifts and starts with Saul, who is the first king of Israel. But it doesn't start with the beginning of Saul's reign. It starts with the end of Saul's reign. So we'll be looking at that a little bit today, and then we'll also be looking at then the start of David's reign. So what we're going to do is first of all just look at the kings of the United Israel, and I was going to put up on the screen the kings of the United Kingdom, but that would, I think, would confuse maybe some of us, because we're not talking about the UK as we find it in our land, but it is a united kingdom where all the tribes of Israel are all together. And so there were 3 kings that were part of the United Israel, and then after Solomon it split. And but what Chronicles is mainly concerned about is the tribe of Judah, the lineage of the kings from David onwards, because the Messiah, the hope of Israel, the ultimate hope in the Lord Jesus Christ, is then found in the line of David. And that's what Chronicles really is concerned about, is substantiating that. And there's a lot of bad kings, good kings, mediocre kings that are strewn throughout there, and that's what we're going to spend our time looking at, is these particular individuals and what they did and didn't do. So anyway, so the first king of Israel was Saul. Now, in a perfect God economy, as it were, really the type of government that was preferred, if I can put it in those terms, was what would be called a theocracy. And a theocracy means rule by God. And and under Moses, that was how the children of Israel were governed, is that they were governed directly by God. And but the Israelites wanted a king, and they wanted to be like the nations, because all the other nations had monarchies. They all had kings. And they wanted to be like that. So Saul was raised up by God, but it was more to demonstrate the fact that really, as I have here in the next bit here, it was a reflection of the heart of the people, because the people wanted to be like the nations. They wanted to be like everybody else. So God's then response to that was, okay, if you want a king, I'll give you a king, and he'll be just like you. He'll just be not interested in the things of God, not interested in the rule of God, not interested in the commandments of God. And so Saul very aptly demonstrated in his life that he was very caught up with himself. In fact, there's a story over in Samuel where it says that he erected a monument to himself after he took on the Amalekites and all that kind of stuff. But he didn't handle it right. He didn't do it right, yet he thought he did it right. And so he set a monument up to himself, which was a pretty arrogant sort of thing to do. But Saul's heart was not for the things of God. And so it was really a reflection of the heart of the people. But as I have on the screen there, Saul's reign, some people think it started around 1037 and then ended around 1010 BC. But the Bible in the Old Testament is not abundantly clear, really, as to when Saul's reign started and how long he actually reigned. Now, in the book of Acts, I think it's in chapter 13, it does say that Saul reigned for 40 years. Now, I believe that there was a bit of overlap between Saul's reign and David's reign, because when Saul was really making a dog's dinner, and we're going to look in a few moments here at the reason why Saul was then taken out, as it were, by God. So, but it is kind of interesting that the narrative for First Chronicles starts with the death of Saul. It doesn't go into any of Saul's exploits in terms of what he did over the period of his reign. But again, this is what Chronicles is concerned about, is not the line of Saul, but it's the line of David. So David reigned from 1010 to 970 BC. So he reigned for 40 years. And he reflected the heart of God. Now, that's not to say that David didn't get it wrong sometimes. We know that David sinned. David, there was this, the adultery with Bathsheba, there was the taking of the census. There was a variety of things that David did that weren't really right. But he was described as a man after God's own heart. And so when we look at the life of David and some of the stories here in First Chronicles, we'll see that he had a great concern about the heart of God. And so David raised up a man who was interested in the things of God. Solomon then came after that and reigned from 970 to 931 BC. And he started well, but later got it wrong. So he wrote the book of Proverbs. He wrote a variety of things in the Bible, but yet he got caught up in his own sort of self-importance. And when we get to Solomon, we'll be looking at those sorts of things. But really, it was then under his son Rehoboam, and he took actions that then promoted division, where then the 10 tribes of the nation of Israel, then up north, then went under the reign of a guy called Jeroboam, and as the Bible says, that made Israel to sin. And so they went off into the bypath meadow and had no good kings. They had no concern for the things of God, and they were taken into exile quite early. So, but the First Chronicles doesn't concern itself really with the northern tribes at all, other than to say under when Rehoboam was in charge that there was this breakaway, and Jeroboam was mentioned by name. But really, outside of that, there's very little mentioning of the northern kingdom. So now the kings of Judah, just to go and take a quick scoot through them. Rehoboam was the first king under the divided kingdom, and I'm not going to say all the dates here. You can see them on the screen for yourself. And of course, this is all BC, before Christ, so that's why the numbers are getting smaller as they progress. And as I have these people in kind of an orange color, that is to demonstrate that they were not good kings. They did not have a heart for God. That doesn't mean that there weren't people around that didn't have a heart for God, but leadership tends to then set the tone for the people. And so underneath the leadership of Rehoboam, things went particularly bad. So, and then his son Abijah took over, but he was no great shakes. But his son Asa, have it in green there, he was a good king. Now, things ended badly for Asa, but by and large, Asa's reign was good and was well informed, and there's some great lessons we can learn from the life of Asa. And then Asa's son Jehoshaphat reigned, and he was a good king, and he was the first king that was described as being like his father David. And anytime that there was a king that was described like that, who was compared to David, they were a very good king. Now Jehoshaphat was not devoid of his problems either, but by and large, he was a good king. Jehoram was a bad king. He followed after the gods of the land and worshipped idols. Ahaziah, another bad excuse for a king, didn't reign all that long, as you see there. He only reigned a year. And then there was Athaliah. And Athaliah was a queen, but she was some bad crack altogether. She was a really nasty woman, and killed all the royal heirs, and she just had one big fat screw loose in her head. But she was then taken out, and then Joash, who was Ahaziah's son, then became king. Joash was a good king, but he was only a good king as long as Jehoiada, the priest, was alive. And then when Jehoiada died, then Joash went, followed after the gods of the land and all that kind of stuff. And so again, he did good things, but it was superficial things. And there's some great things we can learn from his life as well when we get there. Amaziah, his son, was a king. Now he was a good king, but he was I would say he was more mediocre. He wasn't a great follower of God, but he was described as good. Because he did set a spiritual tone for the land at the time. Then his son Uzziah was a good king, and he reigned 52 years. He was the second longest reigning king of Israel, and so he was a good king, but unfortunately had a bad ending. A lot of these kings who started well, a lot of them ended up having a bad run at it at the end. So, but then there's Jotham, who was a good king, not noted for an awful lot, but he was described as good. Ahaz, his son, bad piece of work. Now, under Uzziah, Jotham, and Ahaz, the prophet Isaiah was around, and around particularly for the reign of Hezekiah. So he was around for the reign of 4 kings. In fact, it was in the year that King Uzziah died is when Isaiah, who was possibly about 17 at the time, came into the function of being a prophet. But Jotham and Ahaz didn't really last all that long as kings, but Hezekiah was a very good king, another king that's described as having been like his father David. So now Hezekiah then had a son called Manasseh, and Manasseh, out of these kings, in terms of being the worst of them, this guy took the biscuit. He did come back to God after he was taken, as the Bible says, by hooks to Assyria. But he reigned for 55 years, and the tradition has it that Isaiah was sawn in two under Manasseh's reign. So Manasseh sacrificed children and did all kinds of very nasty things. So, but there's always things we can learn even from the bad kings. Ammon, Manasseh's son, not a good king. Josiah was really the last of the good kings. Again, another king that was compared to David. He brought back into practice the the Passover and a variety of other things. The kind of dusty book of the law was found under his reign. So we'll be looking at him as well. Now the last kings there just before the exile, Jehoaz, Jehoiakim, and we have alternative names there like Eliakim, Jehoiachin, and Zedekiah. Those particular men reigned for a few years. Jehoiachin's reign was very short. I think it was around 3 months. But all those men did not have a heart for God. So you can see there in the green that there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 kings that were described as good. So anyway, so let's just talk about the death of Saul here briefly, and see where we go with this. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to read the chapter to you, just to get the set the stage here, because so it says, now the Philistines fought against Israel, and the men of Israel fled from the Philistines and fell slain on Mount Gilboa. And the Philistines overtook Saul and his sons, and the Philistines struck down Jonathan and Abinadab and Malchishua, the sons of Saul. And the battle pressed hard against Saul, and the archers found him, and he was wounded by the archers. And then Saul said to his armor-bearer, draw your sword and thrust me through with it, lest these uncircumcised come and mistreat me. But his armor-bearer would not, for he feared greatly. Therefore Saul took his own sword and fell upon it. And when his armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he also fell upon his sword and died. Thus Saul died, and he and his 3 sons and all his house died together. Then all the men of Israel who were in the valley saw that the army had fled, and that Saul and his sons were dead, and they abandoned their cities and fled, and the Philistines came and lived in them. The next day, when the Philistines came and stripped the slain, they found Saul and his sons fallen on Mount Gilboa, and they stripped him and took his head and his armor and sent messengers throughout the land of the Philistines to carry the good news that to their idols and to the people. And they put his armor in the temple of their gods and fastened his head to the temple of Dagon. But when all Jabesh Gilead heard all that the Philistines had done to Saul, all the valiant men arose and took away the body of Saul and bodies of the sons and brought them to Jabesh, and they buried their bones under the oak in Jabesh and fasted 7 days. So Saul died for his breach of faith. And he broke faith with the Lord, and that he did not keep the command of the Lord. And he also consulted a medium seeking guidance, and he did not seek guidance from the Lord. And therefore the Lord put him to death and turned the kingdom over to David, the son of Jesse. Now, the reason I read all that, and that's the entirety of chapter 10, but there seems to be something kind of a bit strange here, and that is, in the first paragraph, you see that Saul kills himself. But then at the last paragraph there, from verse 13 onwards, it says in verse 14, it says, therefore the Lord put him to death. And so that sounds like 2 conflicting pieces of information. You know, did Saul kill himself, or did God kill him? Because it's saying both. I think it's one of these things where Chronicles again is having a perspective of God's sovereignty, and it's about God's way of handling the affairs of men for his own purposes. And I mean, let's realize that the Lord gives and the Lord takes away, as it says in the book of Job. And God is in charge of these things. So so the fact that Saul killed himself really was underpinned by God's will, as it were, because Saul did not have a heart for God. he was given much opportunity to get it right. So God's not being, a nasty ogre here, but neither is God going to take things lying down and go, oh well, whatever. That's what happens with people. You know, Saul had was representing Israel. He was king of Israel, and therefore he needed to honor God in how he led. He didn't do that. He didn't honor God in anything he did. And so God's name is at stake here. And so God then took opportunity, as it were, to sort of take him out. And so the book of the book of Chronicles is putting it pretty clearly that God put him to death. Now that doesn't give man carte blanche then to go and execute people like perhaps God does. God is the one who is in charge of all things. And as it says in the book of Romans in chapter 12, it says, "Vengeance is mine; I will repay," says the Lord. And so it's God's prerogative, not our prerogative. So, but I want to just look at sort of why Saul died. Okay, based on these couple of verses at the end of this chapter, and so Saul died for certain things at the start of verse 13. So his breach of faith, and that's what it says there. And then it describes what this breach of faith is. It says that he broke faith with the Lord in that he did not keep the command of the Lord. So, because it says in Hebrews 11:6 that without faith it is impossible to please him, that he who comes to God must believe, one, that he is, and two, that he's a rewarder of them that seek him. Saul did not seek after God, and he didn't keep the commands of God, and so that was his breakage of faith. It was his breach of faith, is that he did not keep the command of God. The other thing he did was that he also consulted a medium seeking guidance, and he did not seek guidance from the Lord. So, and this was the witch of Endor, which was up sort of northern part of the country. And because Saul wanted to go through the witch in order to find out, conjure up the dead soul of Samuel, and there's a big story about that in First Samuel, if you read it back there. Now that particular story is not relayed in Chronicles, but other than this sort of short mentioning. But what it demonstrates is that we cannot be going to, if we're going to be seeking guidance, we cannot be going to mediums or any other agent where we think we're going to be getting some kind of message. Sometimes people think it's a bit fun to go and read horoscopes and kind of play around with stuff. And even when you go to a Chinese, there's the big temptation of saying, oh, what, am I the year of the cat, or the year of the snake, or the year of this, that, or the other thing. And then you go around the wheel and you check out what it says, and you say, oh, it's just a bit of fun. But the problem with doing that is that when you look at those things, what it does is it produces then doubt, and you go, well, maybe this thing does have something to say to me. Maybe I will get fame and fortune, and and all those kinds of things that come along with the proverbial fortune cookies and all that kind of stuff. So we have to be very, very careful about these things and make sure that we're not involving ourselves, even in a fun way, with things of darkness, because there is plenty of darkness in this land. And there's a lot of areas within Ireland that are very dark. That the area of down past Omeath, going in past Carlingford and down toward Dundalk and that kind of area. Very, very dark part of the world. Lots of witches' covens and different things over there. A lot of devil worship. There's devil worship all over Northern Ireland. In Craigavon, there's a witches' coven of about 1,000 witches. And I know this from talking to people and stuff. So there's a lot of dark things going on, and the devil wants us to maybe not involve ourselves in such a high level with that. But what it does is it produces doubt, and it causes us to say, well, maybe those things are right, and God is wrong. So here with Saul, it says he consulted a medium seeking guidance, and he did not seek the guidance from the Lord. So therefore, the Lord put him to death and turned the kingdom over to David, the son of Jesse. So that's how the narrative sort of starts in regard to the history about Israel. Was basically you have this man who really got it wrong, but then David shows up on the scene, and David is this big breath of fresh air, which is in chapter 11. Now, I'm going to look a little bit at David's mighty men, and these and this is what chapter 11 really is about, is David being anointed as king in Hebron, which he reigned as king there for 7 years, and then when he got into Jerusalem, he reigned 33 years there. But chapter 11 is full again of a whole pile of names, and but I want to spend some time looking at some of those names today, and then I'm going to finish this up next week, because I want to look at the names of these mighty men, and some of them, their fathers are mentioned, others they're just where they are from is mentioned, but there's a lot to learn from their names, because you know me and names, there's a whole big fat sermon in them. So, but David was a uniting agent because he is God's man, and so God is demonstrating. Look, when man does their own thing and performs their own thing and relies upon their own wisdom and goes after their own understanding and the gods of the land and what have you, things go very badly. So. But David is handpicked by God, and David's name means beloved, and so he is God's man. But David is not a one-man show, and this is what we will see about David, and we'll see about the other kings too, because the bad kings in particular either were just concerned about their own selves, or they surrounded themselves with a bunch of agents. So whereas David surrounded himself with godly and strong men. So now, some of those men, maybe later down the road, didn't quite get certain things right, like Joab and people like that, but by and large, what David did initially is that he had these mighty men, these men that were strong in character, they were strong physically, they were chiefs amongst the other mighty men, and so on and so forth. So we're going to look at a handful of these particular men who are noted for doing certain things, and then down toward the end of the chapter, it does give quite an extensive list of these people. And it's interesting that a number of them come from foreign powers or from foreign lands. So David wasn't exclusive when it came to surrounding himself just with Israelites. He was seeking godly men, even amongst the nations, because they did exist, So, but so the first man that was mentioned, really by name, was in verse 6 there, where it says, "Now David said, whoever attacks the Jebusites," and these were the people that lived in Jerusalem of the time. Okay, so Jerusalem was occupied by another group of people, an ungodly group of people, and because they said there in verse 5, "But the inhabitants of Jebus said to David, 'You should not come in here.' Nevertheless, David took the stronghold of Zion, that is the city of David." Yeah, what you have to realize with Chronicles 2 is it kind of goes backward and forward a little bit in terms of chronology. Because verse 6 is kind of going backwards again to say, well, how did this actually happen? So David took the city, but who was it that helped David to take the city? So it says, "Whoever attacks the Jebusites first shall be chief and captain." And Joab, the son of Zeruiah, went up first and became chief. And then David dwelt in the stronghold, therefore it was called the city of David. And he built the city around it from Milo to the surrounding area, and Joab repaired the rest of the city. And so David went on and became great, and the Lord of hosts was with him. So Joab was a very, very key person, and his name means the Lord is a father. But it also gives his father's name, which was Zeruiah, who, funny enough, that particular word means wounded or cracked. And so, here was a man who had, some parentage, a background that was cracked and had issues and problems and baggage, and some of us come from lives of that, where we're, have problems. There's cracks in our lives, there's wounds and various sorts of things. And yet what Zeruiah did is he named his son Joab, the Lord is a father. So, and some of us come from backgrounds where our fathers didn't do us any favors. And they may have mishandled us or mistreated us in some way, or maybe just weren't there. And so, but Zeruiah understood this from his own experience, and he says, you know what? If this is really going to work, then the Lord needs to be the father. And so that's what Joab's name means. Now, I did initially think it meant the Lord is my father, a very personal thing, but it doesn't. It means the Lord is a father. And so for Joab, he was a pretty rough and ready character, very pragmatic man. But toward the end of David's career and that kind of stuff, Joab did get himself in a bit of an old twist up. But I think it's interesting that the first thing that is addressed here and that God sees as important is the fact that the Lord is a father, and probably then more importantly, is the Lord your father. And so when people are surrounding themselves with men or individuals that are going to encourage them in the things of God, then one of those hallmarks, one of those pillars has to be God's your father. And so God is not just off some resource somewhere that you tap into every once in a while. The Lord is the one that stands alongside of you. He holds you up. He demonstrates to you, everything that you need. He's reliable. In fact, the word father in the Old Testament literally means the strength of the house or the strength of the tent. He was the pole that actually held the tent up. If you didn't have a pole, then the tent collapsed. So and it was seen quite physically like that. So father, so the word father, which was Ab, which is where you have the Joe Ab. Ab is the father bit, and Joe is the Lord part. Um, so the fatherhood of God, extremely important. Now the next man that's mentioned in verse 11, I'll just start at verse 10 here, just read it. It says, now these were the heads of the mighty men whom David had, who strengthened themselves with him and his kingdom, with all Israel, to make him king, according to the word of the Lord concerning Israel. And this is the number of the mighty men whom David had. So then this starts a bit of a list here. So verse 11 says, Jehoshabeam, the son of a Hechmonite, not really terribly sure what that is, but anyway, he was chief of the captains, and he had lifted up his spear against 300 and killed by him at one time. So here's quite an extraordinary guy. But his name, Joshabim, means the people will return. And so I found that as a bit of a prophetic statement, because the people under Saul were demoralized, they were scared, they were running around, and just a bit at loose ends. And so here's a man whose name means the people will return. And so the people under David's reign are going to come back, and they're going to be united, and they're going to be of one people. So so I think that's an important caveat there. And then the next person mentions verse 12, and it says, after him was Eleazar, the son of Dodo, Dodo, the Ahohite, who was one of the three mighty men. And he was with David at Pasdamim. Now there the Philistines were gathered for battle, and there was a piece of ground full of barley, so the people fled from the Philistines, but they stationed themselves in the middle of that field, defended it, killed the Philistines, so the Lord brought about a great victory. So this man here, Eleazar, was part of that, and so his name means God is a helper. Where it says El there at the beginning of the name, that is the word for God, which is derived from the Hebrew word Elohim. And then Azar means help or helper. So God is a helper. And that's what we need in our life. We need, David needed to have a man that demonstrated that God is the main helper. And if you dig into that particular word help, it talks about somebody who has understanding, that uses tools with you, and sometimes those tools can be somewhat harsh, and in the sense that it was a picture of a mattock or a plow that dug into a field, and you had to break up the fallow ground in the field in order to get the thing to grow. If you just threw seed on top of a hard, dusty, beaten down track, the seed would be picked up by the birds of the air and would not germinate or anything like that. So Eleazar was this man who had an understanding that God was the helper, and that God sometimes uses difficult things in our life to kind of break up the fallow ground, and God seeks out that which is important to do that. So Eleazar's name is quite a significant name. But his father's name was Dodo, and it may sound a bit kind of funny, because if we think about a dodo, we think about somebody who's dumb or dopey. But anyway, this is a Hebrew name, not an English name. But that name is very much related to the word David. So if you see the two D's in Dodo and in David, there's two D's, and so David's name meant beloved, and Dodo meant loving, and so they're very much related names. So his dad was a loving man, and so he lovingly then named his son God is a helper, and so these fathers that are mentioned here, even though they came from like Zuriah, came from a difficult background, God was able to get in and change things about and help them to promote fatherhood and promote help, and that's what David needed. David needed to know that God was his father and that God was his helper. And so now, just a couple of more people, because I'm not going to get through the whole rest of this today, but Abishai was the father of a gift, or was generous. Now, he was the brother of Joab, so therefore his father was Zuriah. So because of Zuriah's background, again, the things that he then instilled in his own sons was be generous. And because sometimes, we as people can get a bit stingy and sort of say we have rights, and I'm not giving to so and so because it's me first and that kind of stuff. Zuriah was not a selfish man. He named his sons in such ways that it again promoted the heart of God. God has a father heart. And here with this particular son, Abishai, father of a gift, being generous, give, and the Lord Jesus Christ himself says it's more blessed to give than to receive. Benaniah, who's mentioned in verse 22, he was quite the man. So it says Benaniah was the son of Jehoiada, the son of a valiant man from Kabzeel, who had done many deeds, and he had killed 2 lion-like heroes of Moab, and he also had gone down and killed a lion in the midst of a pit on a snowy day, and he killed an Egyptian, a man of great height, 5 cubits tall, which is about 7.5 feet. And in the Egyptian's hand there was a spear like a weaver's beam, and he went down to him with a staff, wrestled the spear out of the Egyptian's hand, and killed him with his own spear. And these things Benaniah, the son of Jehoiada, did, and won a name among the 3 mighty men. So Benaniah was an incredible guy. He did some very, very amazing exploits in terms of dealing with foreign big guys. But his name means the Lord has built, and and God builds into us all of what we need in order to be more than conquerors in our life. We're fronted up about a whole lot of stuff, and sometimes we feel just like we want to go and crawl under a rock and collapse and all that. But yet, this man's name meant the Lord has built, and boy, what a great name, and I think these men, they would just reflect on their own name and say, well, this is what God has made me to be. This is what I'm named. This is my identity. Then I can rely upon that. So you have Joab, Eliezer, Abishai, Benaniah. These are men that had names that, by and large, had God as the very heart of their name and their identity. So and because Benaniah knew that God built him, as it were, then he was able to stand up against these lion-like heroes of Moab. and he had gone down and killed a lion in the midst of a pit on a snowy day. I mean, can you imagine such a thing? That down in something on a snowy day, it would be be slippery. Trying to get out of this pit. And yet, it didn't matter about the environment. God had built him just for these things. So, but his father's name was Jehoiada, which means known by the Lord. And again, what a great name, name of a father, and because he was known by the Lord, and he was going to name his son, so his son would do great exploits for God. So, so these were all part of the sort of the top end of David's mighty men. And so what we're going to do from sort of verse 26 onwards is we're going to look at some of these other men who don't have stories attached to them, but they're David's mighty men, and we can learn a lot from their particular names. So anyway, we're finishing up just a little bit later on. That was because we had a big technical glitch. But